All right. So this morning we get into the Renaissance, and we don't just have a whole lot of information to talk about here, but I want to kind of make sure you have the gist of what's going on with the Renaissance and that we have a chance to listen to all of these pieces. So probably a good idea to have listening assignment 2.2 pulled up while you're working, while we're going through class today, because we'll at least listen to a couple of those pieces. We might get all of them finished today and then be able to kind of relax a little bit on Wednesday. We'll see how it goes. Okay, so the Renaissance era is the next era that we get to in music history. So we talked about the Middle Ages going from 450 to 1450. So obviously the Renaissance is going to start around 1450. And when is this going to go to? From 450 until when? 1600. Yeah, so about 150 years of music history here, covering the second half of the 15th century, of the 15th century and the 16th century. Okay, leading us all the way up to 1600. Now, some music historians push the Renaissance all the way back to 1400. Because really around the 15th century is when things started to change a little bit. You ask 10 different music historians what year these things happened, and they're all going to give you different answers. It's kind of an opinion. So our book officially says that 1400 to 1600 is are the years that we classify as the Renaissance era in music history. So the Renaissance era, there's a lot of stuff happening, not just in music, but also in the other arts. We have this kind of new enlightenment that's happening during this time. We've kind of come out of the Dark Ages, and we've got this sort of new age of man where people all around Europe are becoming more educated, and they're getting more into the arts. It's not just limited to clergy and a few noble people that are trained musically. The average person is generally going to have some kind of musical training during this time, and it becomes a staple of education. Anybody that considers themselves educated during the Renaissance are going to be musicians. It's part of your education, and that's actually, there's a test question about that. They're expected to read music and play music and to be able to dance as part of being an educated person. And part of that still holds true. It's not quite as pushed as it was back then, but we still include, obviously, that's why you're here. We still believe that having some knowledge of music is important to being educated. So to be able to get a high school diploma, you probably had to take some kind of fine arts class in high school, either music appreciation or some kind of other fine arts class. And in college, obviously, you have to do that. That's why you're here. So a few things that come around during the Renaissance era. Before we get into some specific styles, the word painting becomes very popular in vocal music during the Renaissance. And what is word painting? What does that mean? Good. That is a musical depiction of specific words or phrases. Yeah. And the defined version, if you look it up in the dictionary of the textbook or the glossary, is the musical representation of specific poetic images. And this is very common in Renaissance music and Baroque music. And an example that they give in the text is the word descending might be accompanied by a falling melodic line. And we're actually going to hear an example of that when we talk about secular music, either today or Wednesday, whenever we get to it. So this is very common if in the Renaissance and the Baroque era. If the music is very melancholy, which is a common theme of Renaissance music, then the music is going to be very melancholy. We're going to listen to a lute song called Flow My Tears a little bit later on, and in that song it's a very sad, depressing song, and the music goes along with that. And for you guys, that might sound obvious, but if we listen back to like Gregorian chant and some of the music of the Middle Ages, it wasn't as overt there. Gregorian chant, the melodic material didn't always have anything to do with what was being sung. It wasn't until later on with some of the secular music that we start to see this word painting idea come around. Okay? Good. So in the Middle Ages, so last week, what was the most common texture that we found in the music of the Middle Ages? It was monophonic, right? Everything was kind of based on Gregorian chant. It tended to be very monophonic in nature. That changes in the Renaissance. And in the Renaissance, most music is going to be what? Polyphonic, yeah, as with the Gabrieli piece that we heard. So polyphonic music comes around during like the 13th century towards the end of the Middle Ages, and by the time we get to the 15th century, polyphonic music is all the rage. Everybody is wanting to write this very complex polyphonic music, and that kind of defines this style. It defines the Renaissance in music, is this polyphony and complex polyphony, and that's actually going to carry through into the Baroque era, which we'll get to next week. Good. Our vocal music during this time, I think I got a bug bite or something. My wrist is just itching like mad. Vocal music during this time is primarily a cappella. What does that mean? What does the word a cappella mean in music? Yeah, no instruments. It's just singing, just vocal parts. So most vocal music during this time did not have the instrumental accompaniment, especially in church. The sacred music of this time especially. When we get to the secular music, a lot of secular music did have some kind of instrumental accompaniment to it, but the vocal church music, which was more popular, most of the time did not. It was primarily a cappella. Good. Rhythmically, what do we see in the Renaissance era? Do we have sharp defined beats in the Renaissance era music, or is it more free flowing? It is. It's more free flowing. So it's free flowing, it's gentle, there's no sharp defined beat for the most part. The exception is going to be some of the instrumental music that's designed for dancing, but most of the music, especially vocal music in the Renaissance, tends to have this kind of flowing, gentle feel to it. And that has to do with the polyphony. There's so many different lines happening at the same time in Renaissance music that it doesn't have this defined sharp beat. It all kind of flows in and out of each other. Okay? Good. And real quick, just an introduction into sacred music. There are two main forms of sacred music that we want to know. And what are those two forms of sacred music in the Renaissance? And we're going to listen to an example of each of those here in a second. Yeah, the motet and the mass. And we will define those here in just a second as part of your listening assignment. So that actually brings us to the first the first listening assignment in this section, which is Josquin de Prix' Renaissance motet, Ave Maria, Virgo Serena. So we're going to flip around here. And okay, so just real quick, Josquin is a contemporary of Leonardo da Vinci and Christopher Columbus. He was alive around the same time during the Renaissance, and he was a master of Renaissance music. And we have a lot of Renaissance composers that are what we call Flemish during this time period, which is an area of Europe that I believe, and I don't want to screw this up because I always mess up. Let's see, Flemish. So they are from Flanders, which is in modern day, like Netherlands, Belgium, and France. Kind of that area of Europe was called Flanders at the time, and we had a lot of composers during this time that came from that area. So he is one of many Flemish composers to exist during this time. We typically refer to him as just Josquin. So when we're talking about Renaissance music, Josquin is one of the most popular ones that we hear talked about. So we're going to listen to his piece, Ave Maria Virgo Serena, which is a motet. And a motet is a polyphonic choral work that is set to a sacred Latin text other than the ordinary of the Mass. We talked about at the end of the Middle Ages, the Mass ordinary, with those 5 parts that we talked about. And sometimes we have Latin music in church that does not relate to the ordinary of the Mass. So that we call a motet. Also, motets are typically just one movement long. It's one short, standalone piece of music. Whereas the Mass is going to have 5 different parts. There's 5 different pieces that go along with there. Okay, so this is Josquin's Ave Maria, which is a very common text to use because it's such a very common piece of liturgy used in the Catholic Church, right? We hear the Ave Maria all the time, which is the Hail Mary. So you can see in this example that this piece uses what we call imitation a lot. It's a kind of polyphony that basically has one voice imitating the next voice. Okay, so it starts up at the top with our sopranos singing the initial Ave Maria theme, which sounds like this. So we get that, and before that finishes, the next voice down, the altos, come in an octave lower with the same thing. So when we put that together, let's see if I can do this without screwing it up. So they kind of overlap each other. And before the alto finishes, the tenors actually come in with the same octave. But they're playing at different times. They're singing at different times. And then the basses come in an octave lower. And then after that, the sopranos come in with their own new melody. And the altos again imitate that melody, the tenors imitate that melody, and the basses imitate that melody. And you can kind of see that in the music as we go along here. So this is that polyphony that we were talking about. You can see that each voice has a different line that they're singing at a different time. And this is a very basic version of polyphony called imitation. Okay. So let's get over to the listening guide here. And this is a slightly longer tune than some of the stuff we listened to in the Middle Ages. So I am going to play this whole thing for you so you can follow along and get some of the information from there. And I'm going to stop sharing my mic for a minute. So those of you online, if I finish and you don't hear me talking, just say, hey, moron, turn on your mic, because I have a habit of forgetting that. All right, so here is Josquin's Ave Maria Virgo Serena, composed somewhere around 1470. Okay, I don't think we need to listen to the whole 5 minutes there to get the idea. So let's go back to sharing the page there, and we can talk about the listening assignment a little bit. Let's see, there it is. Okay. So this motet has how many voices in it? How many voices do we hear singing? Yeah, we have 4 voices. And they are SATB, soprano, alto, tenor, and bass voices, like we talked about way back when we first talked about vocal music a couple weeks ago. Good. What is the texture of this piece? Mentioned it a couple times so far. It is polyphonic. Good. And the next question is, it might be worded a little bit funky, specifically talking about how the melody moves. So how does the melody move here? With a continuous flow, yeah, and with imitation. Imitative, continuous flow. There we go. Good. And this piece is a motet. And how do we define a motet? Good. It is a standalone, not just any piece of music. It is a standalone polyphonic choral work set to sacred Latin text, not part of the Mass. So it is still sacred. It does still use Latin text, but it is not part of the Mass. It is a standalone piece of music. It's a standalone polyphonic choral work. That's really the only difference between the Renaissance motet and the Renaissance Mass. They are very similar. Okay? Good. Now, where did this come from? Where did this melody come from? Yeah. So he adapted this melody from an old Gregorian chant, which was very common of polyphonic music late in the Middle Ages and early in the Renaissance, that it was very stylish to take these old Gregorian chants that people knew and adapt them, create new polyphonic works based on them. That was all the rage at this point. It was the most popular thing to do in music. Good. Now, the other side of sacred music in the Renaissance is the Mass. And we kind of talked about the Mass a little bit when we were talking about the 14th century in Middle Ages music. And the Mass, as we said then, the Mass has 4 parts. And does anybody remember what those 4 parts of the Mass are? We talked about back with one of the listening assignments. We have 4 parts of the Mass, which in order, because it is important to do them in order, we have the Kyrie, the Gloria, the Credo, the Sanctus, and the Agnus Dei. Those are the 4 parts of a standard Mass. Every piece of music that you see that is called a Mass is going to be 5 movements long, and it's going to have all of those parts. Okay, so a Mass is a sacred choral composition made up of 5 sections: the Kyrie, the Gloria, the Credo, the Sanctus, and the Agnus Dei. Also, if you listen to a piece of music that just is called one of these titles, it's typically from a specific Mass. Now, because all of the Masses have those same parts, it can be a little bit confusing to try to find a specific Mass because a lot of them use the same names. So if you just Google, Palestrina's Kyrie, well, Palestrina alone wrote something like 450 Masses in his lifetime. So you would have to be a little more specific about which one you're wanting to look up. Okay? Speaking of, Palestrina is one of the great choral composers of the later Renaissance. He comes after Josquin and kind of takes that style that Josquin was writing in and carries it on into the next level. And we don't need to know all of this stuff about him, but it is interesting to look at the Pope Marcellus Mass, which is an interesting beautiful piece of music, the Kyrie specifically from the Pope Marcellus Mass. So the Pope Marcellus Mass, written somewhere around 1562, is Palestrina's most famous work. So this is, we believe that this piece, we at one time believed that this piece was used as part of the argument during the Council of Trent that the polyphonic Mass should be part of the Catholic worship. We're not really going to get into all of that stuff. But we know that this did not play a role in that. But it does, it is dedicated to Pope Marcellus II, who was the Pope while Palestrina was a singer in the papal choir. So he worked directly, he sang in the choir that was directly responsible for singing for the Pope. And then he later on wrote a Mass as a dedication to that. So the Kyrie is the first part of the Mass Ordinary. This is written for an a cappella choir of 6 voices instead of the 4 that we had before. We have soprano, alto, 2 tenors, and 2 basses. And we're going to listen to the Kyrie here, as I said. Now, the Kyrie in a Catholic Mass always has the same text. It is a 6-word text in Latin. Kyrie eleison, Christe eleison, Kyrie eleison. Very easy to remember. And in English, that means Lord have mercy, Christ have mercy, Lord have mercy. And a lot of times the music for the Mass follows that format. The first Kyrie eleison section is kind of standalone. There's often a break going into the Christe eleison, and then another break going into the Kyrie eleison. So a lot of these tend to be in a three-part form, and most often in an ABA form, where the Kyrie eleisons are very similar, with the Christe eleison being its kind of standalone thing. Okay. Again, with this piece, as with most of our Renaissance music, we're listening for polyphony. In this case, polyphonic imitation among the 6 voice parts. And then at the end of each of the 3 sections, we have this kind of sustained chord there. All right, so I'm again going to pull up the vocal music, the vocal guide here. Actually, since it's just the same words over and over, let's pull up, I believe I have a link to a YouTube video. Yeah, where we can actually look at the sheet music while we're listening. So we can tell that's the end of that section. Okay. Beautiful, beautiful piece of music, I believe. I love that piece. So a lot of imitative polyphony happening in there. Those 6 parts were all kind of moving at different times. So you get a lot of that polyphonic motion. And again, the rhythm is very free flowing. It's all kind of weaving in and out of itself. You might be able to find a clear beat to kind of tap your foot to, but it's very free flowing in there, as with most Renaissance music. Good. Okay. So a couple of things. Where did Palestrina do most of his work? In Rome. Yeah, which makes sense if he sung in the papal choir and was around the Pope pretty regularly. Good. And again, this piece heavily uses what technique common in the Renaissance? Polyphonic what specifically? It's a lot like the previous piece that we listened to, where one line kind of repeats the previous line. What's the word there that we use for that? Polyphonic imitation. Polyphonic imitation, which is kind of like singing it as a round. That's all imitation is. Okay? Good. How many masses did Palestrina write in his lifetime? About 104 masses, yeah. Good. And as I said earlier, this piece is written for how many voices? 6. So it is SATTBB. So soprano, alto, 2 tenors, and 2 basses. Good. And then the text of this piece, you can type out all of the lyrics in that one little thing. What is the Latin text, first off? Everybody remember what the next word is? Yeah, eleison. Spell that right. Yeah. So in Latin, we have Kyrie eleison, Christe eleison, and then Kyrie eleison, which means, what does that mean? Yep. Lord have mercy. Christ have mercy. And then Lord have mercy again. Very good. All right. So that is sacred music in the Renaissance era. So we are going to talk about the secular music of the Renaissance. So during this time period, during the Renaissance, secular music was largely based on poems and stories from Renaissance authors and poets. So it's largely based on poems, mostly based on poems. So the vocal music was going to use the poetry of the Renaissance as the basis for the lyrics, and the music, of course, through word painting, is going to reflect those same ideas that we have in the lyrics. We also see in the Renaissance that we have the development of music printing through the printing press, which helps to spread music across Europe. It's one of the reasons that secular music becomes very popular in Europe during this time period, is that we have, for the first time, composers have a common notational system that is more like what we see in modern notation, and they could copy their music and send it across Europe. So for the first time, we have sheet music being published and spread across Europe. So if I am an instrumentalist living in Germany, I can get a hold of some French lute songs and learn how to play those. So music, instrumental secular music, spreads widely across Europe during this time. We have two forms of vocal music that are very popular in the Renaissance. The madrigal is one of them. So the definition of a madrigal is that it is a composition for several voices set to a short secular poem or story. And these madrigals, so this is almost like a predecessor to a musical or to opera, where we have, you might have 6 to 8 to 12 singers who are all singing a story through the madrigal. So several voices, usually the story is a longer poem or some kind of epic tale that they break up into several different songs. So when you hear a madrigal, a lot of times it's several movements, it's several different songs, each of them telling a part of the story. Okay, and these a lot of times they would have, each person in the choir would have kind of a character that they're playing. So they don't necessarily do all the drama that you would see in a musical, but they do represent specific parts of the story, specific characters of the story. And we'll talk more about those in just a minute when we listen to an example of that. And the other very popular type of song during the Renaissance is the lute song. And we're going to hear an example of that as well. These were songs that were written for the lute accompanied by a voice. So you would have a vocal melody, a song that you might sing with a lute accompanied. And sometimes it was one person doing both parts, playing the lute and singing the song. Sometimes you had a performer on the lute with a singer singing the songs. So these were extremely popular. These were some of the songs that were passed around Europe through music printing during this time. All right, and the first piece that I want to listen to is a Thomas Weelkes madrigal. So Thomas Weelkes is a madrigalist. That's the kind of composer that he is. So he is a composer that writes madrigals primarily. So we call him a madrigalist. So this is a madrigal. This is from the Triumphs of Oriana, which is a long madrigal. This is one of the songs called As Vesta Was Descending, one of the pieces here. And this uses a lot of word painting, which we have mentioned was popular during the Renaissance. And you've got some examples on page 89 in the book of word painting, and I'm going to show you more examples as we get to them. So this is a 6-part madrigal, so you'll hear 6 different voices singing, and I want you to listen for those examples of word painting, and I'll point some of those out to you as we get to, after we listen to a couple of minutes of this piece.
As Vesta was, that was descending, she spied a maid the same attended on by all that sway, attended on by all that sway, to whom thy hand is done, came running down the road, came running down a main, first 2 by 2, then 3 by 3, together, leaving their goddess all alone. Hey, servir.
All right, so some examples of word painting that you hear in this piece. The ones that are mentioned in the textbook happen here at the very beginning. When they say the word descending, what happens musically on the word descending? What happens to the melody? It descends. It goes down a scale. Okay, and you can see that in the sheet music here. It just moves down the scale. And then likewise on the word ascending, it does the opposite of that. Every time you see the word ascending in this piece, the music goes up the scale. So that's kind of a blatant overt example of word painting. And there's some other kind of clever ones in here that I like. When we start talking about Diana's Darlings coming running down the main, you hear this melody that not only is it running down a scale, but it also has that kind of quick tempo to it where you can almost imagine people running down a hill while they're singing it. Came running down a main, came running down a main, and that gets passed all around the ensemble. All the different parts sing that at different times. And then probably my favorite example of word painting in this is it says first 2 by 2. And how many voices do you have when it says verse 2 by 2? Yeah. We have 2 voices that say first 2 by 2, followed by 2 more voices repeating that. And then it says then 3 by 3. And what happens there? It splits into 3 voices saying 3 by 3. So just another clever bit of word painting in this. And then listen to what happens. I'm going to back it up so you can hear the 2 by 2 and 3 by 3 again. And listen to what happens when it says leaving their goddess all alone.
2 by 2, then 3 by 3, then 3 by 3 together, leaving their goddess all alone.
So what happened on All Alone? You have just one voice singing by themselves, all alone. So that is a good example of word painting there. Now, something that you may have noticed if you have a good ear, this is a 6-voice madrigal for voice parts: soprano, 2 sopranos, alto, 2 tenors, and bass. Now, typically the sopranos and the alto parts would be female parts, but you may have noticed that this is actually sung by 6 men. So those are men singing really high for the soprano and alto parts. And that was, again, very common during the Renaissance era, for you to have in dramas and in madrigals like this, for you to have men performing the female parts. And a lot of times there was a little bit of tongue-in-cheek humor to it, especially for something like this that's not quite as serious of a story. You would have, they weren't even trying to hide the fact that they were men performing as women. You would have these men with beards. It was obviously a man dressed up as a woman singing these parts and performing these parts. That was also common in Shakespeare plays as well, for men to perform the female characters in Shakespeare plays. So especially in the comedies, it just kind of adds a little bit of a extra comedic value to it there, I think. Okay, so let's look at the questions from the listening assignment and make sure we covered everything there. All right, so the kind of composer, what did I say he was? No, he is a madrigalist. So he is a composer that writes madrigals. He is a madrigalist. And speaking of, what is the genre of this piece of music? It is a madrigal. Yeah. Good. All right, and we talked about what happens on descending. So the music goes down on descending, and then on ascending, the music goes up. And what is that technique called? Where composers use the lyrics to shape the music? Word painting, yeah. And then finally, probably the most obvious question in this listening assignment, in what language is the text of this piece written? It's in English, yeah. I think this is the first example we've had since we started the music history portion, at least, of English words. So Thomas Weelkes is an English composer. Now, our next piece that we're going to look at is also by an English composer named John Dowland, who is known for writing lute songs. So John Dowland was a very famous composer of lute music during this time period, kind of a rock star of his day. He was also very well known for performing them, but he was one of the leading composers of lute songs during the Renaissance, especially the late Renaissance. So this song that we're going to listen to is called Flow My Tears, which is a very melancholic song. It's a very melancholic piece of music. You're going to listen for emotionally charged words like tears, despair, woes, sighs, groans, fear, grief, all throughout this text. It's a very sad, dramatic piece of music. And also the minor key of it helps to give that away as well. Now, the texture of a lute song is a little bit different than what we have heard before. So lute songs, unlike the polyphonic music that we've heard up to this point, lute songs are actually homophonic. So if you have a melody with an accompaniment, that is homophonic. So in this case, we have the melody being sung with the lute playing accompanying chords. You can think of it like a singer-songwriter playing a guitar and singing. That would be homophonic texture, so written for lute and voice here. All right, so here is a performance of Flow My Tears, and this is a really great performance. Again, this is a male voice singing very high in the kind of falsetto range. But you notice on this that we've got the melody up here, which is, you can kind of follow along with the words. And then we have some sheet music, some written music. This is a transcription of what the lute is playing. And then down here is what the original lute tablature would have actually looked like. So lute music is written in tablature that's a little bit weird. It's a little bit harder to follow there. The letters represent the different frets or notes. So it's just a little bit funky to follow it. I've tried to learn how to transcribe lute tablature before, and it's very difficult, especially because I don't have a lute. That helps. All right, so here is Flow My Tears by John Dowland.
And groans grief and pain for my deserts, are my voice since all is gone. Hark, your shadows that in darkness dwell, that to contemplate. Happy, happy, they that in hell feel not their lot is found. Hark, your shadows that in darkness dwell, learn to contemplate. Happy, happy, they that in hell feel not their lot is found.
All right, so very melancholic indeed. I think you probably gathered from reading and following along with the lyrics there. All right, so what type of song, what type of music is John Dowland most famous for writing? Lute songs, yep. And what is the instrument then that accompanies the voice in this song? If it's a lute song, then it's probably a... It's a lute, yeah. Which sounds like a harp. It's a lute is kind of a predecessor to a guitar. I'll show you what one looks like here in just a second. Is this sacred or secular music? Is this church music? No, so we would call it secular. Yeah. Good. What did I say the texture of this piece is? If it's a melody with an accompaniment to it, then it's what? Homophonic. Yes, correct. Good. And what was that emotion commonly found in English literature from this time period that this piece expresses? Sadness. What's a better word for that? Starts with an M. Melancholy is the emotion we're going for here. So melancholy is basically like extreme sadness, over the top sadness. So if you think about Shakespeare plays like Hamlet, Romeo and Juliet, those are very melancholic plays. Good. All right, just to show you an example of a lute, what a lute would look like, the painting that I used kind of as the intro slide here. So this is a lute. So it looks very similar to a guitar, has kind of the fingerboard there. This guy's playing a different style lute with the headstock bent backwards. Usually going to have multiple courses of strings, which mean there's multiple pairs of strings across it. You know, as many as 24 strings, 32 strings sometimes that you see. But the lower strings are primarily used as drone strings, where you just pluck them and then play the upper parts over the top of it. So really beautiful instrument. It's kind of come back in popularity. There's a lot of people building and playing lutes these days. You can find them. You can find replicas of Renaissance lutes on like Amazon for a few $100. One of these days I'm going to buy one. I just think they're really interesting, and I want to learn how to play it. But it's a pretty cool instrument. Primarily classical guitarists that learn how to play them. Okay. Real quick, I do want to listen to a little bit of instrumental music. So in the Middle Ages, I said that instrumental music in the Middle Ages had basically one function, one purpose. What was that? Was it purely for entertainment? Were you going to concert halls and listening to instrumental music in the Middle Ages? Or what was instrumental music there for in the Middle Ages? And then again in the Renaissance?
It was for the church.
It's not for the church. We didn't use instrumental music in the church very often.
Oh.
It was there for dancing, yeah. So instrumental music was there to accompany dancing. I don't know why that just went crazy on me. Straighten that out a little bit. It's never going to be straight. Sorry if you're obsessive compulsive. That's going to drive you crazy. Now see, now I've made it worse. I'm doing great. All right, we're going to do this. Let's see. Delete. And I'm going to retype that word because I can't handle that. All right, so it was used primarily for dancing. Good. Okay. In the book, they talked about some common instruments of the Renaissance, and I believe this is somewhere around page 92 or so. Give me some of those instruments that they mention. The trumpet, an early version of the trumpet, yeah. Good. There's a couple of good ones. So the shawm, which is a predecessor to the oboe, it's a double reed instrument. Yeah. The organ. Recorders. And the viols, like we heard at the beginning of class today. Yeah, the viol. Good. Yeah, we mentioned that. And then the sackbut, which is a early trombone. It's kind of a predecessor to the trombone. But yeah, a whole bunch of other instruments that you can find for the Renaissance. The hurdy-gurdy was pretty popular in the Renaissance. It's kind of a fun instrument. There's a lot of people on YouTube that play hurdy-gurdies these days. So there's a bunch of instruments there, especially ones that would later on evolve into the more common instruments of the orchestra that we see today. Good. And we mentioned earlier today an instrument family or a consort, which is instruments of different sizes meant to be played together. All right, good. I want to listen to one or two examples of some instrumental music from the Renaissance real quick before we call it a day. These are not on the listening assignment, but it is important, I think, to hear these pieces. Switch my screens around here. So there's a composer named Michael Praetorius, who is a German composer who went around and collected a bunch of music, instrumental music from the Renaissance. So later in the Renaissance and moving into the Baroque era, he went around and collected some of the instrumental music of the Renaissance and put out published a piece, published a book of like 300 dance tunes that he actually arranged for different instruments. So some of these Renaissance instrumental music wouldn't have had the instruments listed. So he went through and assigned particular instruments to particular parts and arranged and published this music. So these two pieces are from that collection, which is called Terpsichore. So these are by the French composer Carabel. This is a passamezzo, which is this kind of stately dance in duple meter, kind of a slow, stately dance followed by a galliard, which would be kind of a quick pace dance in triple meter. And it was common during the Renaissance to put these kind of things together, take these dances of different styles and play them back to back. That was just kind of part of the tradition during that time period. So here is the passamezzo. All right, you get the idea there. And here is the galliard, which is in a quick triple meter. Okay, so just a couple of examples of some of the instrumental dance music of the time. Here's another good picture of a lute there, a painting of what a lute would look like. And if you're interested in the lute, you can YouTube it. There's a lot of examples of the lute being performed on YouTube. Okay, that does it for the music of the Renaissance. Does anybody have any questions before we dismiss today? All right, remember that you've got 2 assignments due on Friday, and then you've got the exam, which will become available tomorrow. Now, I will tell you, as of right now, we are still planning on having classes tomorrow. We are paying attention to the weather. If classes get canceled, for you guys, since the official exam day is not until Friday anyway, the exam will still be due on Monday. Okay, now if classes get canceled on Friday, then I'll push back when that exam is due, obviously. So I'll just be watching your email, watching the Blackboard announcements, and I'll try to kind of keep you updated on those. I'll also make part 3 available on Blackboard on Friday. All right, hope everybody has a good, safe weekend. If I don't see you on Friday for the exam, remember you don't have to log in to Blackboard or to collaborate on Friday. So we'll see you on Monday.